Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. So part of the Earth, you and I now here. Thank you again for joining us for our last but not least session of the entire day. And we will be speaking, the last session, we will be speaking about results conducted by our team from Virginia Tech and Carter School in Ukraine. So Gerard, if you, okay, now we can highlight you too. Okay, wonderful. So Gerard, you should be able to share, right?
Yeah.
The if you can try. So what again? Thank you for joining us for this last session. We will be speaking about our research, which we conducted in September, in July and August, and then continues in October and November about our research. So we, as usually, will have a small presentation, and then we'll open it for question and answers. And my esteemed colleague from Virginia Tech, Gerard Toal, please. You can start the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Karina. So I will talk for a little while, maybe 15 minutes or so, and then turn it over to you, Karina.
Yeah, you take 20 if you need. Yeah.
Okay, so this is research that is sponsored by or as a result of the grant from the National Science Foundation, so we want to acknowledge that. We also want to acknowledge the Ukrainian research firm, survey research firm that we used here, KIS, the Kiev International Institute of Sociology, and their workers in the 3 towns that we did this research, or we had this research organized. And then finally, we want to acknowledge also the research assistants who have helped us with this work. And the graphs here are by Amina Muzaferia from Bosnia, and then also the statistical analysis by Michael, who I don't know if he is he has been ill, so I'm not sure if he is able to join us or not. The conflict in Ukraine, the conflict over Ukraine, the war against Ukraine is often seen as an interstate war, is often seen in very, as was pointed out in the last session, very moralized terms. It's often seen in thin geopolitical terms. And I want to begin with this particular famous tweet from 2014, which has the line, "Geography can be tough." And it's a satirical tweet in order to indicate that this is really, it's a one state invading another state, and therefore what we're dealing with here is a cartographic crime. And I want to say that actually geography can be tough, but that the understanding here of geography needs to be more complicated. What we're dealing with is a post-imperial space, which is still got the legacy of imperialism. It is, instead of seeing the geography in thin terms, we need to see it in much thicker terms, because geography is tough. And geography, in this particular case, involves the geopolitical field is one that involves a former imperial center in the form of Russia, the Russian Federation, and on its periphery, states that are seeking to achieve independence after the collapse of a communist federation, the Soviet Union. So here we're dealing with Ukraine. But within that, there's a secessionist region that is still got, or has a population that has got a concentration of people who are still got a lot of ties to the metropolitan state, maybe loyalists, and look to the metropolitan state and fear the processes of nationalization that are going on in this newly nationalizing state. And then also within the metropolitan state, it has an area which is potentially a secessionist area. So what we're dealing with here are particular structures of decolonization. And then on the horizon, you also have normative external powers who are seeking to increase their particular influence and create new ties with these nationalizing states. This particular process is one which is familiar. It's one that occurred when Ireland became independent of the British Empire. The secessionist region was Ulster. It's also familiar from the collapse of the Yugoslav Federation, when the nationalizing state was Bosnia, and the secessionist regions were the areas that became part of Republika Srpska, and also secessionist regions within the Krajina of Croatia. And it is familiar from the case of the Soviet Union with Georgia, where the nationalizing state then provokes a reaction in Abkhazia and in South Ossetia, and in Moldova, where the nationalizing state, or fear of a nationalizing state, creates a reaction in Transnistria. What is different about the situation in Ukraine is, of course, the fact that it takes 20 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union before we have the emergence of a secessionist region. And even then, terming it a secessionist region is deeply problematic, because in effect, what we had is the metropolitan state, as a consequence of it making judgments as to what's in its own interest, begins to break the nationalizing state and turn people who are potentially suspicious of the core of the nationalizing state, turn them into people who have to make a choice. And there's, as a consequence of that, you have the deliberate breaking of Ukraine by the Russian government. The reason for that, of course, as we all know, is the Russian government sees itself in a geopolitical competition with the United States, so it justifies its particular actions in geopolitical terms. But of course, from the perspective of the nationalizing state, what this is imperialism and the reassertion of a long history of imperialism. What the reasons for this are multiple, but you have the annexation of Crimea, you have the creation of storylines on the part of the regime of Vladimir Putin, who seeks to re-legitimate his long rule, his dictatorship in Russia in new terms, by providing a sort of agitation spectacle of annexation for the Russian people. And so you have the annexation of Crimea, you have a concert following that, you have this idea Crimea is close to our hearts. Then you have the continuation of the war in 2022, and of course that's the somber anniversary that we are marking today, where you have the expansion of this imperial desire to break Ukraine and take more territory from it. And then you have the final proclamation of these as part of Russia in September. Now, this map is somewhat dated because more of Kherson has been taken back by the Russian state. But in effect, what you have is the replay of this particular strategy, where you have the Russian state sponsoring particular separatist groups, essentially proxy actors that represent only a portion, and maybe not even that. They effectively are instruments of Russian foreign policy, although there's a small portion of the population in these regions that have a pro-Russian sentiment, but it's very much minority sentiment beforehand. And you have, again, the spectacle of the country at war, Russia, the fortress. So what you're dealing with here is a situation which is, as was pointed out in the last session, it is a cosmopolitan. It involves multiple layers, but it's really impacting in a very tragic way the people that are living in these areas and people throughout Ukraine. And so what we're looking at are the tragic dilemmas of the costs of war versus the cost of peace. And this is, of course, what conflict resolution has spent a lot of time doing, acceptable versus non-acceptable trade-offs. And in particular, we're looking at the idea of sacred values, and that is things that are not negotiable, things that fall outside of the logic of something that can be traded. One of the things to bear in mind about sacred values is that there are different things that people hold to be sacred, and often there's a hierarchy of these and they come into conflict. What I'm going to talk about is how this relates to territory and territorial thinking. And the hypothesis that we began with in terms of this research is that the prospect of land for peace, given what I've just described, is unacceptable to the Ukrainian people for multiple reasons. But just let me give you three. First of all, the norm of territorial integrity. This is against international law, and if you believe in a just world, this is outrageous. Secondly, in terms of the civic identity of Ukrainians, this is an attack on Ukraine as a polity, as a nation state with a certain a country that has a territorial dimension to it. So there's a commitment to territorial indivisibility. And thirdly, territory is seen as a sacred value. That's a hypothesis we had, but this is even more intimate sense that it is our land, it's our homeland. And while territorial invisibility may be associated with a civic conception of the nation, territory as a sacred value often as a discourse is associated with an ethnic, ethno-nationalist conception of territory. So we're asking, okay, what is going on in terms of how people are processing this dilemma? How does their war experience change this dilemma? And then we also have a question about how does perceived international support change that? I'm only going to say one thing about that, but it's a very important question that we can potentially discuss later. The survey sites are 3 survey sites. We had a key survey, 1,812 local residents and IDPs. So we wanted to catch both people that have been directly impacted by the war, forced to flee their homes, as well as local residents very close to frontline areas. Now there's difference. Zaporizhzhia is extremely close to front lines. Dnipro a little less so, and Poltava a little less so as well. But Poltava is not that far from Kharkiv, and Zaporizhzhia, a lot of the people that were fleeing in the summer from Mariupol were going to Zaporizhzhia and Dnipro. All of these areas were suffering from, but particularly Zaporizhzhia and Dnipro, from shelling. And subsequent to this particular research, which was conducted in July, have suffered a lot more. Some of the sample characteristics of the survey, I don't really have time to do that right now, but we can talk about it later. Bottom line, in terms of sacred values, people give us, we had an open question. What four things are sacred to them right now. Protecting families is number one. So life and protection of families, number one. Defending the land from invasion, the independence of Ukraine, Ukraine's territorial integrity come in, roughly second. So the sort of the territorial comes after life. And it's this particular dilemma that we trace in the research. So the most sacred value in life is the safety of myself and my family. So overwhelming agreement. This is the y-axis. I want you to pay attention to this. So this is 100% here. Now we go to an undivided national territory. So this idea of territorial indivisibility is an essential value for the Ukrainian nation. As you can see, a little, it drops, but it's still very, very strong. And so that is, in terms of measure of intensity, that is a kind of revealing in and of itself. Then we put these things together. So the contrast between an undivided national territory and then sacred value is life. So what happens when you have to fight for your territory and when lives are being given up fighting for the territory? And so we posed a series of questions on this. We've posed a question which led with this idea of sacrifice, that people are dying, and therefore it's more important than ever that Ukraine never concede any territory to Russia. As you can see, that's strong agreement with that. So there's this sense that this is a sacred struggle. There's another slide which has data where we have data on that, where people see the cause as a sacred one for Ukraine. What does this mean? Well, let's take that same sentiment and let's look at it by framing it in a somewhat different way, where there we lead with the future of the nation and the costs from death. So it is imperative to seek a ceasefire to stop Russia from killing Ukraine's young men. So a sort of a very different framing of that clash between life and territory. And as you can see, this is the y-axis here is only at 50%, but there's a diversity of opinion here. And that the diversity of opinion leans towards people agreeing with this. And internally displaced persons, personally impacted by the war, they tended to express a stronger belief that seeking ceasefire to prevent the deaths of more young men is vital to Ukrainians. So those that are directly impacted had to leave their homes, who would have seen death, who, well, lots of people have seen death, but are profoundly impacted by it, are more likely to lean towards a ceasefire. So that is telling in and of itself, and Karina has more to say about that. We then asked about a question which put together life versus territory or geopolitics. We should be more concerned about life and well-being, not questions of territory or geopolitics. Again, look, this is at 40%, the y-axis here. So a great diversity of opinion. This is a dilemma, and people are not unified in terms of how to answer that. And that's part of the research. What it's trying to get at is, what are the things that people are not unified about? We know that Ukrainians are unified on many different things, but these are dilemmas. And then this one here, where we said, what's more important, to save the lives of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians, or to continue the war to free all territories, including Crimea and the Donbass? And we wanted to name those as areas that were occupied by Russia and that had been occupied, parts of the Donbass certainly, since 2014. And so, as you can see, there's a diversity of opinion here. So that's part of the dilemma here. And it's that where you have a group that says saving lives are more important, freeing territory is very important. And then these are folks that are in the middle here. we asked, we give people a whole series of kind of scenarios and asked them, are they going to be acceptable or not? We're just looking at the absolutely unacceptable scores, because that's where most of the scoring happened on these, even though we have said fully acceptable, somewhat acceptable, in the middle, mostly acceptable, absolutely unacceptable. Well, nearly everyone was answering in terms of the absolutely unacceptable here, which goes to show you the kind of the sentiment. So what is the most absolutely unacceptable? That Ukraine loses the right to determine its own future. So people see it as a war for their future, for their own particular identity. The second thing, Ukraine concedes the territory Russia seized from Ukraine in exchange for payment $1 billion a year for 10 years. One of the things about sacred values that we know that inflames it is when you juxtapose that which is not tradable for something which is seen as part of a trade. So what is part of a trade? Money. Well, I'll give you a certain amount of money, you know, in order to buy this land. And you can see that creates a backfire effect. And so that's why that is really so strong, and that indicates to us that the idea of territorial integrity is really quite sacred to a vast majority of Ukrainians. There is difference in terms of how people approach the territories, and I think there's worth making a distinction between something which is abstract, not wanting to give up territories, and then when you talk about Crimea, you talk about the Donbass, then you have somewhat different sentiment here. So Crimea becomes recognized as part of the Russian Federation. 58% see this as unacceptable. That's different from the Donbass. Donbass never returns to Ukrainian territory, 67%. This is one of the last slides I want to leave with. And I'm going to open up a can of worms with this slide, but I think it's important that we have a discussion about it. What does the level of Western support do to how Ukrainians are thinking about, there's my 20 minutes up, how they think about the conflict? And what you can see from this one question is Ukrainians, when they seek advanced weapons to, you know, we ask them, what do you want advanced weapons for? To defeat Russia, in other words, to push towards victory, or to negotiate? Now, our understanding, the dominant, what the Pentagon and the Biden administration says, is we're providing arms to allow the Ukrainians to be in a best position to negotiate. Ukrainians, from ordinary Ukrainians that we surveyed, and this is from the summer, and there's been a lot of killing since July, they see these weapons in order to defeat Russia. They want victory. So that's what's really important here. And that's the kind of last slide that I will leave it on, and then turn it over to Karina.
Sorry, I will continue speaking about, first of all, how war did change Ukraine itself, its perception of people who they are, what their identities are, and how they see Russia. So my first part will be on self-perceptions, but also how people position themselves within different identities. And the very first slide show you that you probably already saw a lot in other publications or other discussions, that Ukrainians start strongly identify themselves with Ukrainian nation. It's overwhelming. We see very strong support for Ukrainian nation, connection to Ukrainian nations, but then we go and ask people about identification with Europe. We see still pretty strong difference. It's distributed, while more people agree with it, still there are pretty big group of populations which disagree or even strongly disagree that they're European. Then we very carefully ask questions about Russian culture and language. While we still had a pretty strong disagreement, there were groups which somewhat agree or even strongly agreed, especially around Dnipro IDPs. And as Gerard already told, these were people who mostly were coming from Donetsk area and South Mariupol area. So culture, and this is very important, if we put two slides together, what you will see is that identification with Ukrainian nation doesn't mean that people completely lost their language, Russian language, or opposite way, identifying and using Russian language doesn't mean that people have any loyalty to Russia. And this is very important because, of course, there are a lot of discussions. Today was very interesting presentation of our Nobel Peace presenter, winner presenter, and she told very interesting that, and sadly, that a lot of people who were tortured by Russians, imprisoned by Russians, they refuse to speak Russian because it's now identified with them with trauma and torture. Nevertheless, we really have to understand this complexity of Ukrainian identity. And what was also interesting for us is to measure still existing or not existing Soviet identity, and did it change? We didn't, of course, ask, do you have Soviet identity? We used two questions, historical questions related to living USSR and living, you will see second one connected to the Lenin. And you see here that there are still a pretty big groups of people who disagree that living in US was a positive step. If you connect these two groups, you come for more than 20% of population on this topic, even during the situation of the war. Similarly, then we ask, all monuments to Lenin must be demolished. You see two groups of people strongly disagree and somewhat disagree with this particular group. Again, a majority here, it's Dnipro IDPs, it's usually, again, people from mostly mostly Donetsk area and South Ukraine. Here we also see IDPs in Zaporizhzhia, also probably going from Donetsk region. So this really showing us that still existing this pro-Soviet connection to Soviet era among the people despite the war. A second question which we possess, how actually war impact perception of Russia. And we explored three types of boundaries. Social boundary, which is classic boundaries between nations, between ethnic groups, how we see us different from already existing official entities. And in this case, we ask people two set of questions. I'm just showing two questions. First set of questions was related how they see the difference, and second was how difference produced normatively. What are norms in society? And if you can see, very interesting, then we ask people, is Russia or Ukraine are completely different nations? Then there is a little bit less agreement with it, but people all agree that it should be a norm in society, that Russia and Ukraine should be seen as a different nation, which really show us how different produce through the norms which exist during the wartime. Then we ask symbolic boundary, and symbolic boundary is how we perceive culture, values, how we perceive symbolic interactions between people. And when we ask if Russia and Ukraine have very similar culture, then you see distribution is almost equal. And most people who disagree with it, and people who are local, it's not who live in Zaporizhzhia, Dnipro, while IDPs who live closer to Russian border, they were more agreeing with it. And then we ask, there are strong difference between Russian, Ukrainian and Russian citizens. Here we get more agreement rather than in a cultural way. Finally, we ask moral boundary. And here it's very important, we really see this new emerged boundary, which strongly connected with the dynamics of war. When war comes and civilians were specifically targeted, and the whole collective axiology of defining in group and out group become extremely silent, become extremely salient and strong in their implications for perceptions. So people do not believe that Russian and Ukrainian have equal morality, and they believe that Ukrainians should behave better. They spiritually stronger than Russians. So this was a very important new discovery, which we found this new emerging, very strong moral boundary. And it's especially stronger than I was conducting interviews in October 2022 with refugees. I found this was one of the most strong narrative about this morality of Ukrainian people much stronger. And the second important part which I want to talk, and it will be a little bit interconnected with what Gerard already presented, but in showing a little bit different part of it. So it was very important for us also to explore another research question was how war experiences shape attitudes toward peace and war. And literature is very undeveloped from one side. You can be surprised that there are not a lot of literature on it, but existing literature still doesn't have any consensus. From one side, we can see that while violence in Colombia increased support for peace, other studies in the same country found that attitudes toward peace were not strongly correlated with experience of conflict. So some, and I can give much more examples of the research, which doesn't really show strong consensus about it. For example, in another research was shown that experience of violence does not have no connection with attitudes toward peace. Other literature does show some attitudes, but it has completely different, sometimes opposite interpretation and showing different directions of the effect of exposure. In Colombia, they show that people who have high level of perceived insecurity were strongly associated with negative opinions toward peace agreement, while other study found that people were more victimized by the group involved in peace accord, they will be likely support peace. We also, a lot of literature will show what are mediators, what are factors which impact why people affected by war somehow support peace or support war. And some of them were outlined like threat, stress, negative attitudes toward others. This is what we also used in our research to address these inconsistencies in the literature. Again, you probably saw this already, but I will bring it from the different perspective. Safe life of Ukrainian soldiers, civilians, or continue war to free all territories. This dilemma again, and Gerard stressed it, and I want to stress it one more time. Then we ask during the war direct question. They always create very patriotic, supportive answers. But people living in war, they live in complexities and have to negotiate threats, violence, killings, losing friends every day. And they have to negotiate hate, they have to negotiate the aspiration for the state, their love for their country. It's a lot to process, especially when people more and more traumatized. So these dilemmas which we're discussing now really showing very strongly difference. But what I want to stress on this particular graph is IDP tend to place saving lives over territorial liberation. And you see this sorry, here. You can see here that it's a very strong difference between every time between IDPs, significant difference in descriptive statistics. Similar, then we ask this, it's imperative to seek ceasefire to stop Russians from killing Ukrainian young men. We see exactly the same. You see this very significant difference between IDPs and people who are local. So it's clearly just descriptive statistics already show us that exposure to violence does impact the perception of the war and peace and support for war and peace. So IDPs express stronger beliefs that seeking ceasefire is more important for Ukraine. So then we applied more statistics, and this work in progress. What we found that actually it's not all losses produce the same effect. And this may explain why different research brought completely different answers. So we just need to find and define what we mean by exposure to violence, what we mean, not just tell that they were living in more exposed territories, not that they just did something or they were IDPs, but what loss is there. So what we found that people who lost property, and we asked specifically questions about loss of property, being internally displaced, loss of friend, co-worker, neighbor, and loss of family member. We found that people who loss of property, they were supporting prevention relocations, advancing negotiation, then they were presented dilemmas with supporting war. People who IDPs, they were supporting saving lives and preventing relocation. However, then we measured the statistical impact of loss of friend, co-worker, and neighbor. Then we found that these particular people were supportive of freeing all territories, continuing war, defeating Russia, rather than saving lives of preventing relocation. And this, from the first look, a little bit question of how it could be, right? It's that people who already lost somebody ready to continue. And I will address this in a second. Finally, we asked loss of family member. We, fortunately for people, only had 18 people in our sample of 1,800 people who lost a family member. So we could not find statistical significance, but the numbers which were not statistically significant, but still had tendency to support for war. So then we look into mediation effects, and we run the statistics, and Mike is still continue working on this particular process. So we found that people who lost property, they want to prevent relocation, advance negotiation, because they under stress. Stress create support for more peaceful negotiation, while economic threat actually increase sometimes their prevention for support for war, but it's negotiated with the stress. So it's very interesting relationship which we are now working to explain together with loss of property and IDPs. But for people who lost friend and co-worker, what really leading them for freeing all territories and continue war and defeat Russia is this feeling of the threat to the nation and hate, very strong. Our indexes of hate, we ask people from 1 to 10, and indexes of hate were 9.8. So extremely strong. And this also will basically foundational narrative in my focus interviews with group interviews with refugees, Ukrainian refugees. Again, we could not find anything for loss of family member because it was a small sample and we also working right now on other set of mediators, which we will be, we hope, supported by we applied for new grant with some ideas, what could be other mediators, and we hope that we will be able to investigate it. How peace important? It is. So people tell us that we want Ukraine as a prosperous and peaceful state in the future. So someday, then country will be ready, and we, as the researchers, have to make this information available. So then, negotiation is in the process. We can provide ideas what is important for peace. And this graph showing several ideas. For example, financial compensation for damage caused by the invasion, much more important than just formal apology. This showing us that reparation for war crimes committed by Russia, less important than full cooperation of Russia with United Nations and International Criminal Court or International Tribunal investigation on war crimes. And again, we're really happy to see today all the work which were done by Center for Civic Liberties in the morning, which we heard what they're doing for Ukraine. Finally, who can promote negotiation for Ukraine? We run experimental design where we ask people how much they support negotiation with Russia to complete ceasefire. And what you see in the first, we just ask directly, and then we ask endorsement by Zelensky, then Zelensky endorsed it. And finally, we ask if it will be endorsed by US leaders and European leaders. What you see here that, so red don't support and green support. So if Zelensky supported leadership of Ukraine, people will be more willing to accept ceasefire. However, if it's proposed by outsiders, out-group members, even those who support Ukraine, it will be less supported, like in comparison with no endorsement. So again, it's ideas, some ideas how to work on promoting peace, because we know that at some point will be peace negotiation and we have to be ready to do it. Thank you very much. I stop sharing and I'm exact on time. Can breathe now. So, okay, so I think we can now open it for the discussion. I see a lot of questions in chat. Gerard, do you want to start? So I will rest for a second.
Sure. Okay, so I see these are all questions from one person. Okay, so let's begin with the first one. In light of the old Soviet Union and current Russian mindset of never ceding any territory they have seized, what is the chance they will ever concede Ukraine's recapture of the occupied territory? Okay, so I don't know that we need to attribute a mindset or mentality to this particular attitude into one country or one formation. This does seem to be spatial behavior, which is characteristic of most states, and most people in states tend to be very, very supportive of their own territorial integrity because they're socialized into that. Now, that's separate from saying that there is a human territorial impulse or imperative. I don't think that that is the case. We're not dealing in the realm of sociobiology here, although some people do. Instead, I would argue that we're dealing with people who are socialized into a state system, and a particular logic of that state system is to be very, very protective of your state territoriality. And then, since World War II, the territorial integrity norm has been quite strong. It has also been violated, and there are places where it is violated to this day, including places where the United States is accepting of that violation. And so, for example, the case of Kosovo, depending on your particular perspective, certainly from a Russian perspective, that's a violation of state territorial integrity of, say, Serbia. I think there are perfectly good reasons why Kosovo is independent, and that you would have such things as remedial secession on the part of a minority population who is attacked by a majority state seeking to subordinate them. But you also have the case of Israel-Palestine. I don't need to tell you this. You folks in conflict resolution know it better than I. Hey, Karina, do you want to add anything to
Yeah. I mean, I can go. I completely. I don't think I can add. I can add for this Japanese question if you need to. So it's not just one example. There is Japan has multiple conflicts. It has conflict with Russia, conflict with China, and conflict with Korea regarding the islands. It's very highly symbolic, and majority of these conflicts are, even some people, actually people died during these conflicts around them, but they are mostly highly symbolic and represent particular aspiration of the country. For example, the conflict between South Korea and Japan around Dr. Korean, or Takeshima Island in Japanese. This is a conflict which represents for Korea, South Korea, the independence and aspirations for having independent territory, because Korea didn't achieve independence itself. It came as a result of the defeat of Japan. And for Japan, it's mean the, again, preservation of historical territory. And both of them have museums, and both, the first phrase you see in both museums, Japan has all rights and has all historical records, and Korea doesn't. Or Korea has all historical records and rights, and Japan doesn't. So this is the territorial disputes. Again, there is going international criminal court tribunals, and this is a really good question. That's why I'm answering it pretty long, because I'm afraid that it could be similar disputes, especially around Crimea. Very similar, because I done very extensive research on this dispute in Japan.
Okay.
Oh.
How does the promise to create reconciliation commissions help end warfare? Well, that's a very, very general one. Susan, let's keep that in mind. But Susan Allen asks, what are the next steps in the research you plan? Do you have any ideas about the views of refugees who are outside of Ukraine and how their views develop in comparison with IDPs and the local population? It's a really important issue. In other words, I think we've seen refugees far away supporting ongoing fighting more than people living closely to homeland experience. Yeah, that is a really important issue about proximity to fighting and, long distance nationalism. And there is no easy answer to that. I think that that's something, there is some data which shows that people who are closer to frontline areas are less unanimous in continuing the war. But that's wartime data. It is phone survey data. It is, one of the things that's nice about the research that we've done here, or CUSIV conducted for us, Karina and I would say, is that it's face-to-face. This is face-to-face work. It's different from phone surveys. Phone surveys tend to be attract people who are, very, very opinionated. It's very easy to hang up on someone. It's less easy to do that with the face-to-face, and therefore you get a little more representative sentiment in face-to-face surveys. Now, in terms of the answering that question, it's an empirical question. We'll just have to see. One of the things I would say, though, is that the normal presentation of this war in the media is that this is a sort of homogenizing, unifying experience for Ukrainians. And also that the dying is happening across Ukraine. It's not happening, it's not concentrated in certain areas. So there are people from Western Ukraine that are dying in the Zaporizhzhia, in Kherson, and elsewhere. So it is a sort of a binding trauma of sorts. And so I wouldn't be, I would be skeptical of that we could have a sort of clear geographic division. And that's also true of refugees in terms of them losing people because they may be overseas and the like. This is still unfolding, and so I think that there's lots of empirical questions that we just don't have answers to right now.
Yeah, and I can jump regarding the refugees because I did this because I could not enter Ukraine, so I was interviewing refugees in Prague and Warsaw, 8 groups, focus groups, and you still can clearly see variations within. And it's okay, let's go a little bit. Then you start, everyone has the same voice. But the deeper you go into specifics, the more you see variations. But overall, yes, there are more support to continue war among refugees, especially those who very well already integrated into Polish society, has jobs, their children in the schools. But those who are struggling, they actually do hope to return home. And for them, end of the war means also end of their suffering. So again, it's a dilemma. What we really trying to stress, and Gerard told it multiple times, and I will stress one more time. So then you look into publications, for example, what happening around this several, like around now, there are so many, everyone published something, everyone, all these opinions are so mostly one-sided. But people who live in reality of the war, they don't have one opinion. They have multiple at the same time. They really, then I was doing interview deeper and deeper, they start actually accepting and telling, yes, we live in these dilemmas. I don't know, 1 minute I think this and 1 minute I think this. 1 minute I really want to go home because my husband there and my mom who didn't want to leave. On other moment, I really wanted to continue to fight because we already done so much sacrifice. So there are a lot of very hard dilemmas that people living through, and very simplistic, especially phone, exactly as Gerard told, phone interviews with simplistic questions, yes or no questions, or Likert scale questions. They do not represent the reality of the life of people in the war, of the life of refugees. And it was in my interviews with refugees, people, there were people who returned back from the war. Men, there were several men who were decommissioned because they were wounded. And they look in your eyes and they tell, war is hell, it should be stopped. And this experience, that's why even within the refugee community, you see very, very different voices.
Rather than read questions, could I ask if the folks that are asking them,
maybe, yeah,
Laura,
maybe somebody can.
Laura has a question here. Laura, could you ask that?
Sure. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh,
yes,
great.
please.
Hi, everybody. Great panel and really great work. Very impressed. So I guess the first one was answered already, whether you had a comparison point with the views of refugees who are abroad, the 8 million who are abroad at this point. And so you've addressed that. The second one was just around the interpretation conveyed about how violence affects the difference between the IDP populations and the residents in those 3 cities, and the interpretation that it was the experience of violence that was affecting that difference. And I just wondered if you'd ruled out or already that perhaps those groups had different views even before the experience of violence, and possibly being from different places that are closer to that border with the Russian dominated, speaking dominated areas, etc. So yeah, I just wondered how you thought about that in coming up with that conclusion.
Yeah, this is a very good question, but I believe we tested, I have to look, but I believe we tested on different variables, including how identity impacted. So identity does not. It's really impact of violence, which is the most important. It's the strongest one, but what I really want to stress, we measure it as part of violence by very objective criteria, right? We measure especially, you lost home, you moved, you lost a friend, family member. We didn't measure because some of research will measure in trauma, and I myself as a psychologist, I'm not sure you can measure trauma through the surveys. At least not this type of survey. So we decided to really measure objective impact of violence rather than trauma.
Okay, thank you.
Well,
but it's a very, very good question, yeah.
Yeah. But to add to that, I mean, you do have people from Donetsk traveling into Zaporizhzhia. I don't think we should reify the idea that because they're living in the southeast or further east, therefore they have different views. I think that this is something that is potentially problematic in that quite a number, and I've been involved with other work doing polling in the Donbass before the invasion, there was strong government support in the government-controlled areas of the Donbass. In Mariupol, for example, where the Ukrainian government had put in quite a bit of money in order to rehabilitate that city, and of course was then flattened by the Russians, and thousands died in that whole awful situation. So I think it was Richard mentioned it earlier about the Russian speakers in Ukraine. We need to move away from sort of overly general categories and look at it's not a Russian speakers versus Ukrainian speakers war. It is not really East versus West war. This is a war where you've had an invasion and you've had people who have flocked to the side of the invaders, small group, and then you have most of the people who are in the opposite camp. But those that are, Ukrainians called now collaborators, are a small, from our measurements, are a small portion of the population. And then you have people that are just, faced with an awful dilemma and try to get by as best they can. But, you really can't in this war now. And so therefore you do have expression of patriotic sentiment and overwhelming support for Ukraine, and that, as you pointed out, Karina, its identity for a civic Ukraine, which indicates that there is a rejection of an ethnic vision of Ukraine, a more exclusivist one, which tends to be associated with the west of Ukraine.
Yeah, actually, we didn't show the slides. You're right, Gerard. We had actually data. We asked not only the salience of identity, but we also ask what particular, how do you see Ukraine? Do you see it as ethnic? Do you see it multicultural? Do you see it civic? And overwhelming majority of people were seen as a civic, as an identity of citizens of Ukraine, rather than people who speak Ukrainian or Ukrainians, or rather than set of multiple ethnic groups. I think people avoiding to, again, majority of our interviews are done in Eastern Ukraine, which is majority of people, around 50%, right, of our interviews were conducted in Russian.
Yeah.
It's a choice of the, more than that. So as a choice. So among these people who still prefer to speak Russian, they still overwhelmingly have strong Ukrainian identity as citizens of Ukraine. And because it's caused by the Russians who speak Russian language, it's also, of course, probably creates this avoidance of them not to speak about it as a multicultural.
58% speak Russian.
Selected to speak Russian.
Only 25 or 26% speak Ukrainian at home. Elena had a question about disaggregating IDPs.
Mine was not a question, but rather just a comment that the IDPs are pretty different between and those IDPs who left the areas where the actual invasion took place, and then the IDPs that are relocated from areas that haven't seen active fighting to Western Ukraine or to the central Ukraine. So I just wanted to point out that there are very different identities of people who live, and I would wonder whether it would have an effect on their responses, and whether they have seen the active fighting or not. So that was just the comment. And I
Yeah,
appreciate the complexity. You already sort of commented on definitely on complexity of IDPs and refugees in general. And yeah, thank you.
yeah, that's why we just didn't do just IDPs, right? That's why we asked specifically, did you lose your territory? I mean, did you lose your property? We even had the questions, were you wounded or not wounded? So we had a lot of questions specifically how you were affected, not just by putting them all together as a lump group.
Yeah, but the point is, I think, a very, very good one, and it's one of those, again, potentially homogenizing categories, just like refugees or internally displaced persons. There are hierarchies of, I wouldn't say privilege, but there are hierarchies of suffering and hierarchies of experience among displaced persons. And yeah, there are some that are wanted to stay and were traumatically, forcefully displaced. And then there are others that left early and maybe had the means to go to Western Ukraine or go overseas, and they're not being captured. And I think one of the things, this is very anecdotal, but my impression is that the folks who have ended up in Ireland has taken about 75,000 Ukrainian refugees, are generally much, they're middle class relative to, a lot of the others who have not had the means, who are much more impoverished. Who tend to be internally displaced or maybe only made it as far as Poland. That's it.
Exactly. The
same.
Yeah.
Impression, but it's
no, it's the same. Actually, it's not just my impression. I spoke to university in Warsaw who doing research with and with NGOs who in Prague several NGOs working with Ukrainian refugees. That's exactly the same. And from my own interviews, that middle class, English speaking, those who are able to learn other language pretty quickly. It's very similar languages. If you speak Ukrainian, you can understand easily Polish and a little bit, but still pretty easily understand the Czech language. But yes, I want to confirm that it was really mostly middle class people who succeeded, and those who not, they were returning back. Because if you saw the number of people returning back to Ukraine is also huge. Basically, trains going full both ways.
Okay, so from what I understand, she was asking what's next. Do you have any ideas about? Okay.
Yeah, so we now.
Steps.
Yeah, so we basically finished. I was actually had to brief Gerard today that we now signing contract for our next step, and we will be doing 90 interviews now in Poltava, the same 3 cities. And these interviews will be deeper, so we can exactly answer this question what Elena is posed and Laura is posed. So this will be easier for us now to go deeper into understanding of the work experiences and perceptions of the Ukraine, perceptions of future of Ukraine, and of course support for war and peace in Ukraine and its territorial value. So we're going deeper into it will be randomized interviews, and we hope to get very interesting results.
And other questions? Please feel free to unmute yourself.
Or comments or questions. We still have around maybe 7 minutes because we need to leave earlier because me and Gerard presenting in different place, unfortunately.
Yeah, we have to switch out to
well, I just have a quick I apologize, I arrived a few minutes late, so you may have said this already, but is this work written up yet in any form?
Oh, we published, I don't know, what, 12, 15
no,
article in Washington Post and Riddle Russia, Conversations, and so on. And we spoke at Voice of America and several times.
Okay, fantastic. But the polls themselves are not available, like in an academic.
No, because we still
it's early for that.
we're still conducting. Yes, we're just starting actually doing deep statistical analysis because we wanted to put as much as possible information out.
Okay, thank you so much,
But
and thanks for
they
the
will
link,
be
Gerard.
available. They will be available as soon as our analysis complete. We will definitely put it out on the main so people can.
Yeah, but some of the data is available. I mean, so I've just sent a link to something that's on my website, which lists all the publications from this research from last year. So there's quite a few. You know, there's some in the conversation, and that has links to the data. And then also Le Grand Continent has done a really nice job in creating graphs from the data. So that's also available and in the public arena. So in that sense, yeah, we're trying to get it out. But in terms of translating it into the academic publications and the like, yeah, we're dealing with academic timelines and a situation where there's a lot going on. So that's going to take a little longer. Okay, the last thing, let me just, since Karina and I, we haven't talked about this, but it is something that's coming out of the research that my colleagues, you know, John O'Loughlin, Christian Bakke, Kit Ricardson have done on the telephone survey data that we did in 2022. And one of the things that comes out of that, and it's a political science question, and that is the degree to which levels of support, perceived levels of support from an external patron impacts attitudes. So now, US foreign policy is all about that. We are seeking to impact attitudes in Ukraine. We are standing with Ukraine, showing solidarity with Ukraine. We are going to be there with whatever it takes, as Biden said in his recent visit to Kiev. One impact of that is therefore to ask, does that change attitudes towards peace and towards a ceasefire and the like? And put more bluntly, does the amount of weapons that the US is sending and Europeans are sending therefore make the Ukrainians less likely to think about peace and think about a ceasefire? And the evidence is that to the extent that there is evidence, is that it does impact people's attitudes. So people are less likely to be supportive of ceasefire negotiations, and that particular slide I put up on the end, they're therefore more prone towards victory for Ukraine. So we're doing a lot to support Ukrainians to seek victory, and as a consequence, continue the war. And therefore, there's a potential downside to that hasn't been debated, I think, sufficiently, which is, therefore, are we making the Ukrainians more belligerent? But that's a very pejorative way of framing it. Another way of saying, well, if we weren't doing this, the Ukrainians would have to concede and therefore would be steamrolled by the Russians. So therefore, we're doing the virtuous thing. And it is something as democratic culture we need to debate and have a discussion about the pros and cons and all of that. But certainly the evidence indicates that the level of perception of the level of patron support has an impact on attitude towards conflict resolution, conflict.
Yes, we had this. Yeah, exactly. So it was clear even in interviews that I conducted, because basically every single person which I was talking to told, yes, knowing that I come from United States, so yes, United States support us and will win with us. They support us for winning. So we will be there. They will be there with us to the end of Russia.
Yeah, but it also may be the end of Ukraine too.
Yeah.
In as much as therefore the war goes on, and then it becomes a proxy war, which is legitimated for all of the different reasons. I mean, that's a moral dilemma that
very strong. That's why we really was trying to stress that it's not one shared view of all Ukrainians in that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think with this we will conclude the whole day of very great events which we had here at Carter School. I hope we support as much we can the movement to cease of violence at some particular moment. We also will have one more event coming on 28th on Tuesday at 3 o'clock. There is a group of Ukrainian journalists and activists who come in to speak about women imprisoned by Russia. So we'll have event in person and online. So please do register. Let me see, I will put it here. So this is a link for this event. Please join us, and we hope to continue seeing you at different events. Thank you.